Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with contemporary virtuoso, pianist, collaborator, composer, arranger-producer, and educator, the great Laurence Hobgood. He talked about his latest 2019 CD, Tesseterra, a new program of standards rewoven for a jazz trio and string quartet, with arrangements ranging from Cole Porter to Paul McCartney. He comes from an arts family and started playing piano before he could walk and began formal classic study at first grade in Dallas, Texas. From there, the story unfolded. So please have a listen.
Hey, thanks again for taking a minute out for Neon Jazz. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
You bet. So let's talk about Tesseterra, your latest release. And I want to know, what was the artistic vision for this release?
It was a sort of almost a triangulation, I guess you'd say. Several things meeting in the same expressive palette, if you want to say it that way. So the Kurt Elling record that I won a Grammy for, along with Kurt, obviously, was the Live at Lincoln Center record that featured string quartet. In fact, specifically the Ethel Quartet, which is on Tesseterra. And in doing that project, I just fell in love with writing for string quartet. I just love it. And that sort of melded with what has become my, I wouldn't call it an obsession, but my fascination, healthy fascination, I hope, with reworked sort of jazzified, I hate that word, but I use it, arrangements of more modern pop standards. You know, the way I think of it is that when Bird and Diz and Bud Powell and whoever played Gershwin and Kern and Arlen, et cetera, they were taking the popular music of the day, and even specifically a period that was between 20 and 40 years beforehand, for the most part, and turning it into jazz. And I always have felt that the likes of Sting and Jimmy Webb and Stevie Wonder and Carole King and Paul Simon, you know, although I'm naming some people that aren't on the record, but Paul McCartney and Crosby, Stills Nash, why not, you know? And it just worked for me in the trio plus string quartet format. A little bit different, but it's just what I wanted to do, so I did it.
Right on. So before we kind of get into some of the meat of your career, everything began in the first grade in Dallas, Texas. What was it about music that pulled you in?
My parents were artists, so I was in an artistic household, constantly being exposed to especially all the different kinds of music. My father's older brother, my Uncle Bob, was a very famous Nashville agent. He handled Elvis and Johnny Cash and a bunch of people I could list. And obviously I studied classically to begin with. There was always classical music, there was jazz, there was country music. Being the kid, the age that I was at the time that I got heavily into, admittedly initially, pop music. At a very young age, I was definitely still drawn to anything that had a little bit more sophisticated harmonic makeup. Your 2-chord, 3-chord songs didn't really do that much for me, but when I discovered Chicago and Blood, Sweat, and Tears, and later on everything from Frank Zappa to Earth, Wind, and Fire, I just ate that stuff up. So there really was never any other path for me.
I'm always interested when artists hook up with poets, and you did in 2012 with Robert Pinsky. And what motivated you to layer music on poetry, and how vital do you think that is in our art form?
Well, I think it's not considered nearly as vital as it ought to be, and a lot of my feeling that way is because of what I learned during my, what I have learned during my ongoing collaboration with Robert, which is that the sound of poetry is possibly the most important part of poetry. It's something that I know Robert believes very deeply, and he's written a couple of books on the subject. And this really speaks to me, especially because I've made something of a specialty of arranging for vocalists, which almost always involves an interpretation of a lyric that is different from whatever original rendering is most commonly associated with that lyric. And that idea of looking at a song's lyric as poetry or prose, however you want to say that, but apart from the melodic tones that it is normally associated with, is really the chief tool in deriving extra meaning from the lyric. And so my collaboration with Robert has really sort of overlapped with the years where my feelings in this other category that's very closely related have deepened. So I think that the music with poetry, as long as the reader is mindful of the need for their reading to be musical, that is different from the way they would read it if there isn't music playing. I wish that we were more artistically sophisticated in general as a race of intelligent humans, because I think if we were, that there'd be a much larger audience for that kind of expression.
What's been the best advice that you've gotten from a mentor or your elders in your life that's really helped you with your music career?
Oh, wow, that's obviously a very big question. I would say it sounds, almost corny, and it's very much of a generalization. It affects everything. But I would think that the best advice that I've ever gotten is that old saw about you have to love what you do. The reason I say that is because it's really important as your career develops to make sure that you still love what you're doing. It's really easy as you get into your 40s and your 50s to sort of kind of keep tending the same fire, even if the honest truth is that if you were to sit down and engage in profound self-examination, you would realize that you're not really having fun anymore. You're just doing this thing, and I've made some changes in my life. Some of them have been forced on me, and even some of those were good in the long run. Others have been really conscious, involving, for instance, most explicitly developing the skills needed for writing and producing and shepherding projects, because I would rather be making records, than playing in the Broadway pit, or even a lot of the time touring. I mean, I love touring when it's my group, or if it's an artist I believe really strongly in, but the road is hard, man. I'm going to be 60 this year, I just love being in the recording studio. And to me, it all gets back to that thing of just never losing sight of, artists get told all the time, God, it must be nice to do what you love. And most of the time, they just sort of smile and nod, and they know what people are saying, and they're not going to burden a simple social exchange with a deeper, longer conversation. But the truth of the matter is, it is more complicated than that,
If you have a dream tonight, you run into your younger self, say, when you were just starting out, and you could give your younger self advice, what would you give it?
I would probably, I'm being very candid here, I would probably tell my younger self to not bank as much on the comfort zone areas of my natural gift, which is what I do consider it to be, a gift, to be able to hear things at a certain level and to have good hands, in this instance, for playing the piano. I would tell myself, get into some more transcription, more difficult conceptual questing, and if you do that, don't pressure yourself to be on a schedule with it, but do it. There's certain work I didn't do when I was younger, because I'd been playing since I was a little tiny kid, and it was pretty easy. I was technically certainly adroit. Adept, I guess, is a better word. Adept. I worked my ass off, but like most young musicians, in a variety of ways, I dwelled in my comfort zone, the things that I naturally gravitated towards being good at, and at this point, I have made up some of that ground. When you're young, your brain is developing neural pathways and synaptics that it's going to be different later on. I do believe that. That said, I think that there are things you can learn when you're older that you can't learn when you're younger.
Yeah. Why do you love jazz?
Why do I love jazz?
Yeah.
Well, it's because of the freedom, spontaneous composition, this amazing system of interacting at a super deep level with other humans that have that same instinct. They're within the group of humans that can be said to have pronounced musical gifts. There has always been a minority that also had the improvisational knack, if you want to call it that. I don't think, to my satisfaction, anybody's ever really explained why this roughly, if I just had to guess, somewhere between 15 and 20%, maybe less, of people, and I'm talking about people with musical gifts, but for the vast majority of musicians, I think that those gifts mostly express themselves in, I'm being redundant now, but in expressive and technical ways. The opportunity to actually invent what you're doing as you're doing it, for me, that's what I have to be able to do. I couldn't just, no matter how killing the band was or how amazing the music was or how big the audience was, I just couldn't play the same notes night after night, I got to be able to change it up, and I'm only really drawn to interacting with other people who are doing the same thing.
Right on. So everything's going to come down to this. One final question. It's this. Everyone has a version or a perception of you, your family, your friends, your fan base, but you know who you are. Who do you think you are?
I would say that I am, first and foremost, an enjoyer of life, especially in the sense of wanting to be calibrated with the moment that I'm living in as much as possible.
I love that answer. Hey, man, Lawrence, thank you for taking time out to call me and talk about the new album and your life in music. I really appreciate it.
And I appreciate it too, Joe. I do.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players in New York, Dallas, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to Laurence for his time, music, and cool. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino in the iTunes Store. Visit neonjazz at youtube.com. And for everything Neon Jazz all the time, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.